You've been hearing the word redistricting so much these days. We've covered it here at the Katie Phang News Channel, Texas, Florida, even Indiana. And we thought it was really important for you to understand kind of the core of redistricting, what it means, what it's all about, how is it working. And so I thought, let's talk to the person who would know it the best, and that's Marina Jenkins. She's the executive director of the NDRC, the National Democratic Redistricting Committee. They are doing incredible work at that organization. And I wanted to share with you her insights on what the battleground looks like and why it's so important for us to stay focused on protecting democracy at this critical time. And joining me now at the Katie Phang News Channel is Marina Jenkins. She's the executive director of the NDRC, the National Democratic Redistricting Committee. Marina, that's a lot of syllables, even for me. So welcome to the Katie Phang News Channel. Marina, talk about what the NDRC does.
Yeah, so I know it's a mouthful. The National Democratic Redistricting Committee and affiliates. We have two affiliates, the National Redistricting Action Fund, which is our 501c4 that does grassroots organizing work, and our 501c3, the National Redistricting Foundation, which does a lot of our public education and litigation work. So combined, the NDRC and affiliates is a comprehensive hub for just singularly focused on redistricting and fair representation and trying to build toward a more representative democracy, and doing what we can to make sure that everyone's right to vote is protected and is equal.
So, Marina, I think that in fairness to the people that are tuning in, some people have maybe been paying attention to redistricting over the years. I'm not talking about just now as things are very hot in the media, talking about Texas and California, et cetera. But I think people are more familiar with the term gerrymandering. And something that I've tried to kind of clarify here on my show has been, look, redistricting, it's not a bad word. It happens. And I've talked about the census every 10 years and how we adjust representation pursuant to the United States Constitution based upon numbers and population for the purpose, like you said, for fair representation. But gerrymandering, people sure as hell know what the hell that means.
Yeah.
And we've been following it carefully, and we've been watching it, especially from a legal perspective. And we'll get into that, I guess, in a second about the Voting Rights Act. But talk about why it's so important for us to use the terminology correctly when we're talking about these issues.
Right. And you're absolutely correct. So every state has to redistrict, but you don't have to gerrymander. So after every census, we get the enumeration, which is just a fancy word for saying we're counting everyone. And this has been a real issue in the news lately as Trump and his MAGA loyalists have been pushing for a new census because they don't believe that anyone other than citizens should be counted in the census. But the Constitution is very clear that all persons, all people in the United States at the time of the census get counted. And it's important for two reasons. It's important for representation, because when we know how many people are in the United States, then we go through a process called apportionment, which is how the decision is made as to how many congressional districts each state gets. And the goal of apportionment is so that each congressional district is representing roughly the same number of people. So we have the concept of one person, one vote, and that is derived from this idea that everybody's vote should count relatively equally. So the idea is there's the same number of people in my congressional district as yours. Well, I live in Washington, D.C. I don't have a congressional district. That's another issue. That's a whole other can of worms. Yeah. But the idea is that everybody gets equal representation. The second important thing about the census is that it determines how federal resources are allocated. Again, a very important issue we could spend an entire day talking about separately. But basically the way that decisions are made about how much money a particular state or region or city gets is all based on the census data. So it's incredibly important to know who lives in a particular state, who lives in a particular place, how many people there are across the country, so that we can allocate resources and representation appropriately. So when this happens, then we redistrict. And then, sorry, I've gone on a...
No, keep on going. Keep on going.
So then once we have the reapportionment, then we redistrict. And all states have to do this every 10 years because when we get those new population numbers, then we understand, okay, now we need to, so some states gain or lose districts. So of course you have to redraw the seats in order to adjust for that. But even if a state does not change, say Maryland doesn't change the number of districts it has, but people move around within the state. So you also have to account for those interstate movements. And so you have to redraw the districts to comply with that one person, one vote requirement. And these are all constitutional requirements. This is all what's required by the Constitution. And so then the problem, we see a problem when politicians oftentimes this redistricting process is a legislative process. And so you have politicians who are making those decisions about how the districts are drawn, and they're able to manipulate that redistricting in order to advantage or disadvantage particular groups of people. And that's when we see gerrymandering. That's what gerrymandering is.
Talk about then how, if we have, and I've covered the enumeration clause from the U.S. Constitution here, this idea of counting the whole person, and that there is no exclusionary language stating that you only count U.S. citizens, because that's obviously this quote, Trump wants to go after the quote illegals, right? That's what he says he doesn't want to count. How does all of this interface, though, Marina, with things like the Voting Rights Act? For example, in my state of Florida, I covered here that Ron DeSantis was to redo the census as well. And he wants to start redistricting, or more accurately, gerrymandering now. He successfully did it in my state a few years ago in clear violation of something that we call the Fair Districts Amendment that our voters voted into our Constitution in the state of Florida. How do all of these things interface? Because it sounds like there's federal concepts in the Constitution and in state concepts.
Absolutely. So as you noted, and as I mentioned, each state has its own process, right? So redistricting is a 50-state patchwork process. So what happens in New Jersey is different from what happens in Florida, is different from what happens in Colorado. And so some states like Florida have introduced redistricting reforms. So Florida has what's called the Fair Districts Amendments. Those were passed ahead of the 2010 census and 2010 redistricting cycle. And these efforts, we've seen a real groundswell across the country, in states across the country, where voters, where citizens are the ones sort of starting these efforts and pushing us in the direction of, hey, this should be an independent process. This decision-making process should either be done independently, or at least we need some guardrails. Because under federal law, there are really only a couple guardrails to how states can redistrict. One is the one person, one vote, and that, which I've already touched on. The next is just, the 14th Amendment. And so racial gerrymandering is, intentionally moving folks around on account of their race is violative of the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. And then we have the Voting Rights Act, which prohibits the dilution of the voting power of protected classes, particularly voters of color. And the VRA is the most important tool that we have, and the most powerful tool that we have to protect voters, because it's an effects-based test. It doesn't really ask, okay, well, was the state lawmaker intending to discriminate on account of race? It actually looks at a number of different factors, and including historical factors, present day factors as to like what's happening in the political environment. Is there race baiting happening? Or is there evidence that race is still a really problematic issue in that state or region? And then it also just looks at the numbers, and is there the ability for voters of color to get together, if they are grouped together in a district, to elect what's called their candidate of choice. So are they able to effectuate their political will by being put in a district together? And so that's what the VRA protects. And then, the state laws can add on top of that. So the Fair Districts Amendment have important provisions that prohibit partisan gerrymandering, for example. It's very plain and very clearly written into the Florida Constitution. But, now we're seeing that DeSantis is just kind of saying, we don't care what the state constitution says. I just want to redistrict again and again. The current map is gerrymandered. We just finished you covered the decision out of the Florida Supreme Court. That case is a case that was brought by our affiliate, the National Redistricting Foundation. We've been litigating that case for years now. And, the Florida Supreme Court just kind of threw their hands up and is refusing to give real meaning to the very clear state constitutional language, which that case was about there's a provision in the Florida Constitution that's actually very similar to Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, which was sort of nullified with the Shelby County decision by the U.S. Supreme Court in 2013. And so, the state constitutional provisions can be very powerful, but they have to be enforced. And so the question really becomes then, do you have state courts that are going to be, faithful to the state constitution, or are they going to be faithful to their political overlords?
Which in this instance, I did highlight that the Florida Supreme Court, they're all gubernatorial, they're governor appointees.
Right.
So they're not going to bite the hand that has fed them. These are not lifetime seats for them. And it underscores the importance of paying attention to who actually sits on your state Supreme Courts, for example, because they do control the levers of power more so than the actual legislators do sometimes. But clearly, when they look at something like the Fair Districts Amendment, which was voted in by the people, was a voted in amendment, right? It was something that the people wanted. They've ignored the will of the people. So it gets us to the latest, which is Texas. You talk about brazen partisan gerrymandering. We see that happening right now in Texas. Did you ever think, though, we'd get to the point, Marina, where you have a governor and an attorney general like Abbott and Paxton issuing arrest warrants, going to states like California, Illinois, and asking for the help from those jurists there, the judges there, to issue warrants to basically deliver those Texas representatives back to the states?
It is absolutely unprecedented what we are experiencing and what we're seeing happen right now. To have a sitting president basically issue a directive to Governor Abbott, and then, to J.D. Vance just visited Indiana. There's pressure that we understand. There's pressure in Missouri. There's pressure in Indiana. In Ohio. So this conversation is coming directly from the White House. And so this is really unprecedented. And there's really been only one. And in terms of mid-decade redistricting, the only example is also Texas. In 2003, Texas did a mid-decade redistricting similarly, because there was a sense that they could that Republicans could do better ahead of the 2004 election. And similarly, there was that effort to draw more districts that would favor Republicans. The other thing that's really different and alarming about this situation is not only is the directive coming from the White House, it's coming directly from Donald Trump, but the directive was very explicitly to discriminate on account of race. And so, there was this letter that the Trump DOJ sent to Governor Abbott to purportedly, presumably to give Governor Abbott some sort of cover, right?
Yeah, purportedly.
Yeah. And then the letter says, we're concerned about these districts. And they list a number of districts that are districts where communities of color are able to vote in coalition to elect their candidate of choice. So these are districts specifically where either Latino voters or Latino voters together with Black voters are able to, effectuate their political will. And the Trump DOJ said, no, you need to dismantle those specific districts. And they have, gobbledygook legal reasoning that is just spaghetti at the wall. And Governor Abbott now says, okay, well, we have to do this because, Trump DOJ is telling us we have to redistrict. And in the midst of, this, he issued this, the letter came on July 7th. He issued and added redistricting to his proclamation calling for the special session on July 9th. And remember, the floods in Texas happened over the July 4th weekend. So in the midst of what was happening in Governor Abbott's state, in the state of Texas, where families were still looking for their loved ones, Governor Abbott decides, we need to prioritize gerrymandering this state even further. It's the full, when you really break down all of these elements, it's so alarming and it's really shocking. It's what they're doing.
And you mentioned something that there's been so much going on, Marina, that sometimes it's hard for us to be paying attention. But you mentioned that J.D. Vance, I think on the stealth, has been dispatched by Donald Trump, the White House, to go to places like Indiana. As you mentioned, Missouri's on the table, Ohio's on the table, We know Texas is brazenly doing it. Florida is now very open about it. But people like J.D. Vance traveling with the kind of, quote, imprimatur, the credibility of this White House with his title of vice president is literally having these hush-hush secret meetings with the Republican kind of, his Republican cohorts in Indiana for the purposes of gearing up for redistricting in that state as well.
Yeah. No, and I think Senator Padilla introduced or sent a letter basically identifying that that's a violation of the Hatch Act, right? As you're describing, like using their elected position, their formal position to, accomplish partisan goals is illegal. And so, the unlawfulness is on so many different levels, right? Like what they're doing is wrong on so many different levels. But they're just so brazen. They're so brazen about it. And it's so plain, right? Like this push started happening also in the wake of, the big ugly bill, right? Trump steals medical care from millions of Americans, realizes he can't actually retain control because the American people are very unhappy about what's happening. Yeah. And so instead of trying to convince the American public to allow his party to remain in power in the House of Representatives, what do? They come up with a scheme to go around the country and try to, as he says, get more seats that, and again, quoting him, that he thinks he is entitled to. He used the word, we are entitled to these seats. It's an absolute, it's just offensive to the nature and just everything about our democracy, which is to say, the voters are supposed to be able to have the say, and particularly the U.S. House of Representatives, which is supposed to be the body that most closely, expresses or reflects the will of the American people at, the most popular vote level. And that's where he's trying to manipulate all of the maps so that he can secure and retain power, notwithstanding what the American people want.
So in something that is being equated to the possibility of an arms race, we have now seen governors like Gavin Newsom from very large states like California issue letters like the one that we're going to put up on the screen for our viewers to see. It's dated August 11th, and he sent it to convicted felon Donald Trump at the White House. And the subject line is calling off mid-decade redistricting efforts. And the sum of it is, as you know, Marina, he does call out, quote, unprecedented mid-decade hyper-partisan gerrymandering to, quote, rig the upcoming midterm elections. But he offers that although California will respond in kind if this continues, if the other states call off their redistricting efforts, we, as in California, will happily do the same, and American democracy will be better for it. Yeah. And that's end quote. Marina, I got to ask you your thoughts on this, right? Because there's a part of me that champions the idea of punching a bully back in the nose. Yeah. If there's crazy gerrymandering that's hyper-partisan that's happening in places like Texas, Florida, et cetera, then of course, places like New York with Kathy Hochul and Gavin Newsom in California, we should respond in kind. But then there is a legitimate fear that it takes away it delegitimizes our American democracy when it becomes, like I said, this arms race of mutually assured destruction where we just start trying to figure out who can, gerrymander their states more.
Yeah, I applaud Governor Newsom for having been very clear that the action that he is planning to take is a response and that will not happen if Governor Abbott does not go through with what he has said he is planning and with the bill and the map that we've seen moving through Texas. And, and that they're planning to put it before the people. So there will be a map, but it will be up to the people of California because California has a commission and was one of the states, I think around the same time that Florida was introducing the Fair Districts Amendments, California voters we're getting together to pass, to put a commission together for California. And so, I think there is an effort to do it in the most responsible way possible. But as you note, excuse me, if we are, if one side is playing by the rules and the other side has burned the rule book, we're really not fighting for our democracy with every tool at our disposal. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really what this is. I think, unfortunately, more and more it feels less hyperbolic to say that we really are fighting for our democracy and not to slide into an authoritarian regime. And it just feels daily like that's where we are headed. And so I think it's, as you say, like it's both sides of the coin, that it's, let's try to do this responsibly. We don't want this. Gerrymandering is bad for democracy overall. But at the same time, if we need to have a U.S. House of Representatives that holds the president accountable, if that's what the people want, then we need to achieve that. And we need to figure out, and maybe in creative ways, how to do that. And I think the American people will be with us.
No, and I agree. And I think to your point, Newsom isn't hijacking this process and abusing it like Abbott is, right? Newsom is saying there's an independent commission in my state, just like in New York, right? Versus in places like Texas and Florida, which we all know the common denominator, it's the Republican-led states, wherein the Republican legislators, at the behest of their Republican governor, right? Mm-hmm. They're the ones creating these maps, which, by the way, we've said here, it's insane that the Texas map is a Republican map that they're now having to redo because it violates, according to the Trump DOJ, the law. So it's like lying down, spitting up in the air for these dumb Texas Republicans to be saying that there's a problem with the map that they had done. I want to focus on the work of the NDRC because I think it's very important to elevate and amplify the work that you guys are doing. On your website, one of the things that really stood out to me, Marina, was the following statement. Quote, there's no longer an off season in redistricting. Redistricting is a crucial part of the fight to protect democracy. It is ongoing. Amen. I have been saying there are no off days for us. Yeah. There's no off days for democracy. So talk about a little bit how the NDRC is trying to navigate this insane landscape and do it in a way that's responsible and in a way that's respectful of our democracy.
Yeah, absolutely. We are what we call a era of perpetual redistricting. I think in the sort of modern era of redistricting, which really is just since the 1960s, when, the one person, one vote principle that now feels like indisputable really was introduced in the 60s, part of the civil rights movement, part of this, movement for our country to start realizing the promises of our founding documents. But in this era of modern redistricting, it was this like, okay, every 10 years you have the census, then you redistrict, and then you see what happens with the maps, and then you can adjust after 10 years. And now we have not had the same congressional map for 2 cycles in a row. The map has changed between every 2-year House election cycle since 2014. So we are just deep in this world of we really need to fight for redistricting every step of the way. And it's because, at the end of the day, this is about representation, but any issue that you care about, whether it's climate change, whether it's reproductive rights, whether it's tax policy, right? Like any issue that you care about, if we don't have representation that actually reflects the will of the people, then none of that is going to move forward in an effective way. And so what the NDRC and affiliates do is to try to take this issue on from every angle. So, we are supporting we have an electoral program. We support, as you mentioned, state Supreme Courts are an incredibly important piece of our democratic puzzle. So this year, for example, we've got elections in Pennsylvania for the Pennsylvania Supreme Court to retain important jurists on that court. We've been incredibly active in Wisconsin, had a win in the spring election in Wisconsin to elect Susan Crawford and retain the progressive majority on the Wisconsin Supreme Court. The legislative bodies are actually where a lot of the decisions are made. So, we look at, because it's a 50-state patchwork, we look at each state and sort of where are the decision makers and how do we ensure that we're putting people, and supporting candidates to be put into place who are going to protect and defend fair maps. We also engage in working towards building commissions and redistricting reforms where those are happening. We're very supportive of the commissions, the new commissions from the most recent cycle in Colorado and Michigan. I think there's just, we have like this niche, but at the same time, because it's a 50-state strategy and each state requires like this, unique approach to how you're going to engage and make sure that we are setting the state up for success to have fair maps. It's, it ends up being a quite broad, landscape of the work. As I mentioned, we also have a 501c4, work that we do there is incredibly important. We've seen, just in the life cycle of our organization, which has only existed for 8 years, we're still sort of in our first, 10-year cycle, so to speak. And, getting folks to be aware of this, it feels like a really wonky issue, but it's also so fundamental and so important for people to understand. And we've, just anecdotally just really seen an upswing in interest in, getting folks aware of what's happening. I think Texas is a great example. Thousands of Texans have been showing up to these hearings. The energy and interest and understanding of what's happening and how important it is for individuals to engage at their community level has been, a huge part of our work. And then, as I noted, we have a litigation arm. And so the National Redistricting Foundation is, behind lawsuits such as the one in Alabama under the Voting Rights Act that resulted in the new district in Alabama, and the case decision Allen v. Milligan from the Supreme Court in 2023, the litigation in Louisiana, Florida, Texas, Georgia. So, and more to come. So I think we try to basically take the most comprehensive approach to what is, a very narrow world, but a world that has a lot of moving pieces.
We want to be solutions-based as always, where we can and how we can. I know a lot of people that are saying, we're so frustrated about what we're seeing happening in Texas. How can we support? I think one of the ways to do it is to support the NDRC. Can you share with the people that are tuning in now and that'll be listening later, where can they check you guys out for more information and to provide support? Because I think this is a critical part of how people feel like they're actively engaged, especially if they're located in places that aren't necessarily going through a gerrymandering fight right now.
Yeah, thank you so much. And the number one thing that people can do is to text the word action, ACTION, to 36787. Again, text action to 36787, and we will get you locked in and connected with the right community for you. If you're in Texas, for example, folks will be connected immediately to actions that they can take there. There is a national day of action on what's happening on our maps this coming Saturday. There are going to be further rallies in Texas, and as this fight moves from state to state, we will be directing folks there. So that is the best way for folks to get connected to the work, get updates, understand what's happening, and be clued in on opportunities to show up and show out for your community and for others. There are opportunities to call legislators in these states. And so we expect this fight to continue. Texas, as noted, unless they back down, I think we're sort of in for a really rocky year ahead, maybe, in terms of this effort. So we need all the help that we can get, and really encourage folks to get involved and stay up to date. And we'll do our best to make sure you can connect to actions in your own community.
Well, Marina Jenkins, I want to say thank you. This has been an incredibly illuminating conversation, but a necessary one. I feel like when we peel back the layers of things that may seem to be unclear or may not to have, the most distinct kind of definitions about what they are and how they impact us, these are the conversations that are important. Because I want people to feel empowered that they can now share this information that they learned from you and get, like I said, actively engaged in the way that's comfortable for them and in the way that they feel like is making a difference. So thank you, Marina, for taking the time to join me today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Katie.
Katie Phang here. We launched the Katie Phang News Channel in partnership with the Midas Touch Network so we could bring you the latest in legal and political news. Straight, no chaser. So if you're a fellow truth teller, hit that subscribe button and share the word about this channel so we can build a high information America together.